Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a really significant political moment here.
Yeah, absolutely. The very first days of the new government under President Lee Jae-myung.
And you might remember, this wasn't just any election. Highest number of votes ever cast.
That's right, which really signaled a major, major transition for the country.
Especially, after that period marked by impeachment and, well, a lot of social division.
hmm And that record vote count, it wasn't just a number. Our sources really presented as this powerful mandate from the people. It sort of set the stage.
And almost instantly, I mean, the stack of sources. We've gathered articles, columns, reports, they just started buzzing.
Yeah, they capture those immediate reactions, the challenges that popped up right away, and these fundamental debates that just erupted.
Right, the moment the new government took office.
And what's fascinating looking at these early sources is how quickly certain arguments really took shape, foundational ones.
So our mission in this deep dive is basically to guide you through these sources.
Exactly. Pull out the key insights, help you understand the core issues everyone was grappling with right out of the gate.
Absolutely. And we're focusing on two big themes that really dominate these early pieces.
Okay.
First, those immediate, very loud calls for kala, which translates to collaboration, cooperative governance.
That's the one. And second, this equally strong emphasis we see from other perspectives on aha, the rule of law.
So we're going to look at the different angles the sources take on these.
And reveal a pretty surprising detail about the, let's say, practicalities of taking office.
Oh, yeah, that one's something else.
And get into a key debate the sources highlight about, what democratic principles actually mean in this new era.
So yeah, get ready, because these sources, they offer some truly eye-opening observations about what actually unfolded right after the inauguration.
Okay, so let's set the scene. You have President Lee Jae-myung stepping into office.
Backed by that historic mandate we mentioned.
Right. The sources really emphasize this. They see it as the bedrock, the foundation of the new government's legitimacy.
It's framed as a clear expression of what the public wanted.
Definitely. But almost immediately, the sources show this chorus of voices starting up.
Raising specific demands, specific observations about how this new government should, operate.
And according to these sources we've looked at, the loudest demand, right from day one, is this call for collaboration.
Yeah, cooperative governance.
Yeah.
And who's pushing this hardest right at the start?
Well, the material indicates it's primarily coming from conservative media outlets and the opposition parties.
Okay, and this is where the sources really highlight what they see as a significant paradox.
Or, yeah, some explicitly call it a double standard.
They really question the timing, don't they? And the intensity of this sudden, strong demand for
They ask, why wasn't this call for collaboration quite so prominent or maybe as loud during the previous administration?
Under Yoon Suk-yeol, which some of these sources, they characterize his style as more unilateral.
That's the term used. So the insight here, according to these sources, is that true, real collaboration isn't just about the majority party giving ground.
It's more fundamental.
They argue it requires mutual respect, a shared commitment to democratic principles. It means actually listening to the opposition.
Okay.
And genuinely trying to reflect their legitimate opinions and policy where possible.
And this seems like a really critical distinction the sources are making. They're also very clear on what they argue is not.
Exactly. It is not, in their view, the minority party using its opposition role as a sort of master key.
A master key to just paralyze the decisions of the majority?
Precisely. They really push back hard against that idea, the notion that the majority should somehow be intimidated or, effectively stopped by the minority's objections after there's already been due process.
Right. And this is where they bring up the basic principle of parliamentary democracy.
Yeah, the sources strongly defend it. They argue that after deliberation, after debate, if you can't reach a consensus, which happens, right? Then the standard procedure, the kind of common sense of how democracy works, is that decisions are made by a majority vote.
And they give an example of this, don't they, to show what they see as a misunderstanding of L.
They do. There's this specific anecdote recounted in the sources. Apparently, the head of the opposition party's emergency committee, during a luncheon, reportedly with the new president, actually requested that the government halted the passage of laws the majority party was pursuing.
Stop them.
Yeah. And this is cited directly as an example of the kind of, misinterpretation of Dell that these sources are really critiquing.
Okay, wow. So, while that debate is happening, here's where the sources reveal something. Yeah, frankly, stunning.
Yeah, this detail puts those high-level debates into pretty sharp relief.
While the public conversation is all about collaboration styles, there was this striking, almost unbelievable thing happening with the nuts and bolts of actually taking over power.
The sources report that staff entering the presidential office on the very first day one, they were horrified, or some accounts say appalled.
Horrified by what? What did they find?
The offices were completely empty.
Empty how? Like furniture gone.
According to these sources, no computers, no basic supplies. They even say not even a single pen was left behind.
Not a single pen. That's quite specific.
It is. And the sources, they present a very strong interpretation of this. They don't see it as just, administrative oversight or bad housekeeping.
No, their view, stated very clearly in the material, is that this was much more significant.
They call it a clear resistance, a mockery of democratic procedure.
Wow. They argue it was intentional, an attempt to physically paralyze the new government.
Or at least obstruct its ability to function right from the start. And particularly impactful, they note, because this administration began without a traditional formal transition committee already in place.
That makes sense. The impact would be greater then.
Right. And the sources are quite pointed in who they think is responsible.
They name names.
They link it to individuals who apparently remained on staff after the previous president's impeachment. People allegedly getting salaries but not doing their duties.
Okay.
And they explicitly call for a strict investigation and stern punishment. They specifically mention former presidential chief of staff Jung Jin-suk as someone who should be held accountable.
So you've got this public debate about cooperation, and behind the scenes, according to these sources, almost this physical act of obstruction happening.
Yeah, it's quite a contrast. And this stunning practical challenge, it wasn't happening in isolation.
Right.
It played out against this backdrop of intense debate about the legitimacy of the new government's potential actions.
Which brings us to that counter-argument we see emerging in the sources.
Exactly. The call to stop political revenge.
Right. This seems aimed at heading off any actions the new government might take regarding, past conduct or specific individuals from the previous administration.
But the sources, they offer a very strong counter to that narrative.
They don't buy the political revenge framing at all.
Not at all. They state, pretty unequivocally, that holding individuals accountable for violating the constitutional order, for breaking laws, even for acts they describe as severe as plotting rebellion.
Okay, that's strong language.
It is. They say that is not political revenge.
So what is it, according to these sources?
It's the restoration of the rule of law.
And they connect this to the president's own stance.
Yes. They cite President Lee Jae-myung's public statements, emphasizing that establishing the rule of law is the absolute priority for his administration.
So the principle being pushed in these sources is that the law has to apply equally to everyone.
Right. Regardless of their position or power. And critically, they state that ignoring illegality, ignoring past wrongdoings, that can't be spun as tolerance or leniency.
From their perspective, dealing with past violations is actually necessary.
Yes, they present it as a crucial first step for genuinely opening a new era. You have to clear the slate, legally speaking.
And there's a media angle here too, isn't there? The sources touch on that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Some sources point out that certain media outlets that had previously treated candidate Lee Jae-myung almost like a criminal.
Before the election.
Before the election, yeah. Are now suddenly, with the government change, really emphasizing themes like collaboration and tolerance. It's an observation about shifting narratives.
Okay. So looking ahead then, what did these sources anticipate for the new government? Smooth sailing?
Definitely not. They anticipate significant challenges. They predict intense attacks, especially from conservative media.
What kind of attacks?
Attempts to exaggerate any minor flaws, deliberate efforts to sow division among the government's own supporters, that kind of thing.
So given that predicted landscape, what advice do the sources offer to the government or its supporters?
The advice is very clear. They stress the absolute importance of solidarity or firm unity. The term used is hoesha.
Firm unity.
Yeah. They see this as the essential way to counter those anticipated attacks. And they warn strongly against getting bogged down in what they call internal criticism or infighting.
Why? Isn't criticism healthy in a democracy?
They address that. They acknowledge healthy criticism, oversight, they call it, the salt needed for strengthening democracy.
The salt. I like that.
But they add a really important caveat. This criticism shouldn't undermine the main cause. It shouldn't become a self-harming act that just ends up benefiting opponents.
So discretion is needed about how and when criticism is voiced, maybe within the base.
That's the suggestion. Use judgment. Don't give ammunition to those trying to tear the whole thing down.
Right. Makes sense. And the sources also circle back to the purpose of winning the election, right?
They do. They reiterate, look, the fundamental reason you won is to implement the policies and the vision you promised.
Using the authority the people gave you.
Exactly. Using that authority, legitimately granted, strictly within legal boundaries. Exercising that power isn't dominance, they argue. It's actually a democratic act. It's what you were elected to do.
And perhaps the most critical point, certainly one that gets a lot of emphasis in these sources, concerns control over key state institutions.
Yes, the power institutions. They specifically mention agencies like the military, the National Intelligence Service, and especially the prosecution.
Why the focus there?
Well, they point to recent actions, particularly by the prosecution service, as a kind of stark reminder of why democratic control over these bodies is so essential.
Because they wield so much power.
Immense investigative and enforcement power. And their actions, if not properly aligned with, civilian democratic oversight, can directly impact the political process itself.
So losing control means what?
Losing control, the sources warn, means you risk being swayed by them. You risk a return to the past, a kind of democratic regression.
They seem to see this control, particularly over the prosecution, as absolutely vital.
They describe it as the last bastion of democracy itself. It's that crucial.
Wow. So the sources sort of wrap this section up by reinforcing that idea.
Yeah, they reiterate. This government was put in place by the power of the people through democratic means.
So
maintaining those principles of democratic common sense, like majority rule after debate and exercising firm democratic control over these critical power institutions, is presented as absolutely key.
Key to its success and, preventing things from sliding backward.
Exactly. There's this sense captured in the sources, maybe a cautious optimism, that the country might be finding its place again after what they describe as a long, chaotic period.
But it's not guaranteed.
No. They stress that the work to maintain that, to grow that democratic momentum, it's an ongoing task. It requires vigilance from everyone.
And the public mood at this specific moment.
According to the sources, it's complex. A mix of really high expectations, but also significant concern.
Okay, so let's try and sum up the core tension we've seen explored in this stack of sources.
Right.
You have the new government, President Lee Jae-myung, immediately facing these loud calls for collaboration.
Right. But at the same time, it feels this need, or is being told by some sources it needs, to firmly uphold the rule of law.
And exercise the mandate, the democratic mandate. It was given by the people.
And all of this is playing out against a backdrop of what the sources describe as significant resistance.
Both in the political talk, the discourse, and also, as we saw, in that really startling practical reality of the empty presidential office.
Yeah, that image really sticks.
So the key insights we've pulled out from these sources. First, understanding how "da" is being defined.
Right, and potentially weaponized by some, versus what these sources argue is its true democratic meaning.
Then the significance, both symbolic and practical, that the sources attached to that empty office incident.
More than just missing pens.
Definitely. Also, the crucial distinction these sources draw between restoring the rule of law and what's being labeled by others as political revenge.
Yeah, two very different things in their view.
And maybe most critically, that strong argument from the sources that real democratic control over powerful state institutions is essential.
The last bastion, yeah.
Yeah.
Essential for preventing democratic backsliding.
So this deep dive, it really isn't just about the specifics of one political moment in one country, is it?
No, I don't think so. It forces you, the listener, us, everyone, to confront these fundamental principles that are at play in any democracy.
Like, how is legitimate collaboration supposed to work? What's the non-negotiable role of the law?
And how should power, once granted, be exercised? And how is it held accountable?
Which really leaves you with this final thought, maybe something to mull over. Considering everything these sources highlight, how do societies, any society, successfully navigate that inherent tension? The tension between the political desire for cooperation, which sounds good, and the absolute necessity of upholding legal principles and holding power accountable, especially during big moments of change and transition like this one.
That's a huge question, and it's a dynamic that, as you say, reaches far beyond this specific context we've been discussing today.